Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 246 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, your one-stop shop for all things FCPA compliance related. Today I do something a little bit different and something I've wanted to do for some time. I go through risk assessments under the FCPA, but the difference is I'm doing it from a PowerPoint, and each time I change the slide, I identify by saying next slide. I don't think it really interferes with the quality of the presentation, but what I want to do is provide you a copy of that slide deck. So if you will self-certify to me that you've listened to this podcast all the way to the end, I will send you a copy of the slide deck so you can have that for a more complete review of my views on risk assessments under the FCPA. The episode comes in at just over 21 minutes. Once again, it's something I've been wanting to do, and I'd love to get your feedback on how you think it works. This is Tom Fox, and thank you very much for listening.
Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and today I wanted to visit with you about risk assessments. Obviously, risk assessments are an important part of any best practices compliance program. And indeed, the FCPA guidance talks about the importance of risk assessments. It underscores that a risk assessment underlies all parts of your compliance foundation and states risk assessments are fundamental to developing a strong compliance program. A one-size-fits-all compliance program is generally ill-conceived, and that devoting a disproportionate time of your policing to modest gifts and entertainments, for instance, instead of focusing on large government bids, questionable payments to third-party consultants, or excessive discounts to resellers and distributors may indicate that a company's compliance program is ineffective. What this really points to is that you need to assess the risks for your company going forward. So with that, next slide. The risk assessment is a continuous process. It looks at gap analysis of risks and controls. From that, you come up with a remediation plan, and their next step is implementation. But then the process starts over, and you really should have a continuous process for your risk assessment so that as new information comes in, you can update your risk assessment. But more importantly, as your company moves to new markets, new products, new services, new customers, this will also impact your risk assessment. So certainly it's something that you need to do on an annual basis. It does not mean you need to do bring in an outside party, but it's really, think of it as a continual process. So a risk assessment is a continuous process, and you need to continually input the new information and data that you have into your risk assessment going forward. Next slide. There are different types of risk assessments, and here I want to detail three: the formal risk assessment, the hybrid risk assessment, and the informal risk assessment. A formal risk assessment is where you use an outside consultant, a lawyer such as myself, a third party such as PwC or Deloitte, other third parties that may do risk assessments. You document your review, you interview employees across the company, you look at systems and processes with an eye towards reviewing them. You can do culture surveys or focus groups or other small groups where you try to get some more specific input into your risk assessment, and you issue a formal report with assessment and recommendations on your gap analysis. A hybrid risk assessment might be something where you use roundtables to visit with people rather than one-on-one interviews as you would do in the formal risk assessment. You document reviews and process overviews, and once again, you typically will see a final report with assessments and recommendations on a gap analysis. And finally is the informal risk assessment. This is used for your continuous updating. Here you can utilize, or typically you see, surveys or questionnaires. But most importantly, it's based upon new business information, operations, new products. What I really talked about in terms of the types of continuous information that comes forward to you throughout the year. So the informal risk assessment, I think, is becoming more important because the Department of Justice wants to see you doing this on a more regular basis. So your informal risk assessment has really risen up a level or two in importance, and is something that you really need to think about and focus on going forward. Next slide. So when you use outside counsel, there's the 1-2 punch of documentation and then the advice of counsel. Obviously, your risk assessment process should be documented. This means that however you do your assessment, that process needs to be explained in the document itself so that a third party or outside regulator who's reading it can understand how the assessment was made. There's no magic formula to an assessment, but the reader of the risk assessment or the report needs to understand the process that you used. And second of all is the importance of securing an opinion letter from outside counsel blessing the risk assessment process is reasonably designed to identify and weigh relative risks. So the advice of counsel letter is something that every company should have. It hopefully will give you some cover, although we have seen even as recently as last month in the VimpelCom FCPA enforcement action, an opinion of counsel letter was worthless because the company hid information from the lawyer who provided the opinion of counsel around the identity of a third party who was a government official. So if you withhold information, that's going to negatively impact the effect of your advice of counsel letter. Next slide. So how often should you conduct your risk assessment? This is a question I'm asked. The FCPA guidance would suggest a formal risk assessment at least once every 3 years, unless there's a major change in your business operation, such as acquisition, sale, or a refocus of your business. Your hybrid risk assessment, here I would suggest every couple of years, depending on the needs and complexities of your risk assessment. Since you can use a less formal process, which I detail of roundtable of key players, your ethics and compliance committee, and you can use less formal ways of interviewing. And then in your informal risk assessment, here you're using surveys and questionnaires, perhaps some targeted interviews, but this is something that you really need to do on an annual basis. So the FCPA guidance says a formal risk assessment at least every 3 years. The last two, the hybrid risk assessment and the informal and continuous risk assessment process, I would suggest as fillers for the formal risk assessment coming in at every 2 and 1 year annually. And this shows that you're committed to this process and that if you move forward to remediate based upon what gaps you've determined in the risk assessment, this is what the government wants to see. Next slide. So what is risk? What is the risk that you're going to be assessing? Obviously, the risk of legal violations is something that you need to determine. But what about your code of conduct? How often do you assess code of conduct violations? What's the risk around promoting the culture of your compliance? And by that I mean, has senior management struck the proper tone, and is that tone communicated down through the organization? Promoting accountability. This is something that I think is becoming more important with the introduction of the new Compliance Council from the Department of Justice, Wei Chin, who joined in November. She has certainly talked about having the accountable business units doing compliance going forward. So the accountability in your compliance program is really being driven down, and this is another reason to help guide your risk assessment going forward. And then finally, preserving reputation. As bad as the fines and penalties are in an FCPA investigation, and whether you're the FCPA professor identifying 3 buckets of pre-settlement costs, settlement costs, and post-settlement costs, or you're looking at just the total cost, obviously they can be quite high. But I've come around to thinking that it's the reputational damage that in the long run will hurt your company more. And the risk assessment is really a key tool to helping you preserve your reputation going forward. Next slide. So what are the goals of the risk assessment process? Well, obviously you want to identify and evaluate your risks. You want to define your organization's perspective on risks of bribery and corruption. You should note that although you will have a no tolerance policy around bribery and corruption, it is almost impossible to completely eradicate this risk, because you're going to have that risk because humans are involved. But nevertheless, by attempting to eradicate this, you'll be moving forward to having a best practices compliance program, and hopefully detecting and preventing and then detecting something. But certainly, if the government comes knocking, that you can demonstrate that you took the appropriate steps. Also, you want to minimize whatever gaps come up in your analysis. You will need to think about qualitative versus quantitative rankings. The quantitative rankings generally are a forced ranking based on numbers, but you should also consider the qualitative rankings. Here, I mean, if you have a large amount of sales in one area, but it's a low risk area, quantitatively, this may not be presented as your highest risk on your forced rankings. Yet because your income is derived from such a large single area or single product, this might be a qualitative risk that you want to take a look at a little more closely. Next is you should use the risk assessment process to design and tailor your compliance programs and internal controls to your company. The assignment of resources in response to the qualitative ranking of risks and the quantitative ranking of risks. And then identify possible benefits to the improvement of the business operations. So for instance, how many third parties do you have? Have you justified, from a business perspective, utilizing all of those? Do they overlap? Do you need that many? What are the possible cost savings? Have you looked at duplicate payments? Have you looked at overpayments to vendors? Have you looked at whether vendors are entitled to receive the payments that you have paid them for? All of these can be assessed, risks that can be assessed, and can certainly be improvements of your business operations and potentially cost savings. Next slide. So what are some of the results of a risk assessment? Well, the risk assessment is the foundation of your compliance program. You focus on risky interactions and seek to influence them. You will focus your effort on government interactions, on third-party risks, but it also allows you to identify other risks, such as charitable contributions, hiring of relatives, facilitation payments. Gifts, policies, and resources should decline in importance as well. Next slide. What about risk assessment evidence gathering? Well, certainly you should interview senior management with a global view of business by line of business and areas of operation. You should take a sample of mid-level managers who are familiar with the specific markets and environment in which the employees operate. You should talk to internal audit, finance, legal, human resources, and procurement. There should be surveys and follow-up interviews. We've talked about focus groups, and we've also touched on culture surveys. What's the culture of your company? Have you really gotten that message of tone throughout the organization? Is the quarterly numbers more important than following the code of conduct? All of these things can be determined in a culture survey. Next slide. Country risks. Country risks are something that I think everyone has a general understanding of. Corruption Perception Index is a general indication of a level of risks, but that's the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, or the CPI. But it's only a starting point. There are numerous factors which are considered in the calculation of the CPI. Regional and sector factors could vary between businesses and industries, even within a high perception level country of risk. And more specific country by country may be analysis may be needed for significant countries of operation. Once again, if it's significant to your company, there's a probably high risk of you losing that business due to bribery and corruption that you would want to make sure is not present. Next slide. What about industry risks? Well, obviously certain sectors can be identified for heightened risk. Oil, gas, mining, and infrastructure industries. Pharmaceutical and medical device industries have recently been on the Department of Justice and SEC hit list. But have you thought about specific events? So, for instance, Brazil, World Cup 2014, Olympics 2016, all wrapped around the Petrobras scandal. With the recent developments with the Odebrecht Construction Company tied in with Petrobras, this may be something that you would want to look at a little more closely than you would have previously based upon the industry sector. On your industry analysis, you should focus on the level of government interactions, the level of government regulation. What about the large, do you have a large number of contracts involving significant commitments? Another source for information is Transparency International Bribe Payers Index. And of course, you should document all sources of your information. Next, what about foreign government interactions? Here, I think you can start with three broad categories: foreign government sales, regulatory interactions, customs and immigration. What is the extent of your foreign government sales? Is it a large, small number of large transactions or a large number of smaller transactions? What close ties might your employees have to foreign government officials? And how does your company market to government agencies? Within licenses, permits, and regulations, obviously there's some regulatory interactions involved in health inspections, business permits, tax or finance or audit, real estate and zoning. Walmart was called out by the New York Times around real estate zoning approvals, for instance, in Mexico. There should be a detailed review of your regulatory interactions by country, and the type should be collected for further reference. What are some additional risks? Well, payment of money in exchange for unrelated benefits, obviously gifts, hospitality, travel expenditures for foreign government officials are still high on the hit list, even here in 2016. Charitable contributions and political donations and other corporate relations activities, sponsorships of local sporting teams, conference sponsorships are still pretty prevalent as a problematic issue in the medical device and pharmaceutical industry. And then the newly, or at least we've now had 2 enforcement actions involving the employment of persons connected with government officials, close family members, sons, daughters, but it goes out to nieces and nephews. What are some of your third-party risks? Well, here the risk depends on the nature of the representation. Is it commercial or regulatory? Third-party risks with intermediates and suppliers, vendors are reduced by the existence of a business rationale for hiring a third party, the third party's reputation for ethical conduct, the identity, ownership, and activity and experience, and other factors. But some of the other things you need to consider are: what are the length of relationship? What's your sales revenue? Have there been any change in sales revenue? What's the percentage of sales to foreign government customers? Regulatory interactions, the quality of your written contract, training, and the third party's compliance program. Next slide. What about supplier and vendor risks? Well, not all suppliers and vendors are the same. Suppliers and vendors who have interactions with government on behalf of your business obviously present a greater risk, and as well as suppliers and vendors who may sell services to your company. Your supply chain needs to be reviewed for an accurate assessment of the risks, and then a relative ranking of the risk based upon the nature of the relationship, annual revenues, and the length of the relationship. What about gifts, meals, travel, and entertainment? A country-by-country analysis of important gifts, travel, and entertainment issues, the number of interactions with foreign government officials and the amount of those. What about industry conference sponsorships? But most importantly, any payment for travel, meals, and lodging need to be tied to a legitimate purpose, both reasonable and bona fide for promotion. Also, once again, we've had several recent FCPA enforcement actions where travel was engaged in that was more simply sightseeing than for business purposes. So you need to take a look at that as well. What about risk assessments in the area of mergers and acquisitions? This is important to the extent to which your company relies on an acquisition strategy to expand business. You need to have a procedure for an anti-corruption due diligence review. You need to question the effectiveness of due diligence inquiries in the past. And then you need to look at written contract provisions regarding compliance terms and conditions. And for the starting point, you should reference the FCPA guidance on what the DOJ and SEC suggest there. What about weighing the risk? Quantitative measures of risk are difficult except within specific categories, such as internal sales to foreign governments, by country, third parties, and suppliers and vendors. Your risk of detection, in other words, your whistleblower program, whistleblower awards, those types of things. Some types of bribery may be more risky because of the ability of the company to detect or not detect. And impact calculation is more defined, is generally comes from more enforcement. And then it's always difficult to assess and measure the potential calculation of reputational harm. But as I indicated in my previous remarks, this is something that I think is becoming much more prominent and much more important for you to consider. So in your risk evaluation, you should tailor some steps. You should map your risk assessment results to existing controls, both anti-bribery and other existing internal controls. Identify gaps in existing controls in terms of risk not adequately addressed. Design and implement appropriate remedial actions. Training, communication, positive compliance statements will address numerous risks. And then follow up, monitor, and enforce internally. What about the results of your risk assessment? Well, obviously I've talked about focusing on the government interactions in the commercial and regulatory area. Third-party due diligence screening, renewal, and monitoring program. That your risk should create a risk-based formula based on the specific factors that you've come up with. Your M&A due diligence to protect against successor liability. A broader focus on financial controls. This is something that I think most compliance practitioners don't really make the tie to effective best practices, anti-corruption compliance with financial controls. But if you think about authorization, segregation of duties, contract manager, invoice payment procedures, which traditionally are thought of as financial controls, these are really compliance internal controls as well. Focus on gifts, meals, and entertainment. Hopefully will decline as you move forward, but it also helps you to staff and resource allocation based upon the risk factors you've come up with in your risk assessment. So that is some of my thoughts on risk assessment. I hope that this will provide some information for you going forward.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this podcast episode on the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. As I promised, if you've made it this far, I'd be happy to send you the PowerPoint slide deck this podcast was based on. If you'd like a copy, just shoot me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening.